I get so excited as soon as I see we live and we're ready to have this amazing discussion. This is quite unusual for me. Good evening, everybody. It's unusual for me because it's the first time in a while that I'm live at night. We're trying this out and seeing whether it's going to work to live stream at night so that we hit all the spots and then we don't have to worry about whether people are available or not. But a very important discussion to have this evening about identity politics in South Africa and where we stand and why everybody feels that we need to be addressing the elephant in the room for many, especially after the results and outcomes of our election, which was in May this year. So I've invited Dr. Oscar van Heerden. He's possibly going to be joining us in a moment. And Dr. Calvin Knowles. They are both political analysts. And we are going to talk about identity politics and what needs to be said that I've kind of felt, welcome, Calvin. I've kind of felt that everybody's been very careful and tread carefully when we talk about people wanting and choosing to belong in groups, even though we no longer have apartheid in South Africa. Welcome to the discussion. Your thoughts on that? Why do we see this happening right now in our political landscape?
Good evening, Lynette, and good evening to the viewers. I think political identity, or the way you identify yourself, or the way you coalesce in terms of political parties, your affiliation and group identity and all of that, that doesn't happen instantaneously. That is formed over time, and it's sort of ingrained. I want to go as far to say almost in your DNA. That is who you are and how you understand your place in the world, your place in society, how you go about in terms of your cognitive processes, in terms of thinking around issues of justice, social justice, and all of those things. So your political identity is essentially who you have become and what are the things or the factors that made you think and act. And in terms of acting would be sort of voting. Now your voting behavior, when you enact your beliefs, your belief system, when it leads to at the ballot box, for instance, when you participate in a protest march. So all of those things didn't just happen overnight. It has been, there's a clear trajectory from where it started. Now, there's a variety of factors. There are academics out there in the world who have studied, political identity. It lends itself to political science, to sociology, psychology, and anthropology, where they made a study or studies saw the light in terms of how is it that people then find themselves drawn to a particular group. So it's important to understand that. I see Dr. Van Heerden just joined us now. Good evening, Doc. So yeah.
How's it, Calvin?
Doc, all right for you?
All right.
Good. Yeah,
okay,
so
I'm just gonna, for the sake of, sorry to interrupt you. Hello, Oscar. We are live already. Thank you for joining us. We'll just see how our connection holds up at the moment. We're having a problem with a delayed reaction and response from Calvin. You're back with me. You froze a little bit earlier on, Calvin. And for the sake of Oscar joining us later, if you don't mind, just summarizing your thoughts again about why it is important that we have this discussion.
I didn't join late. You said in 3 minutes.
We are on for 7 minutes already.
I said 7 o'clock, boss. I said
7 minutes. Yo. sorry, Calvin. Sorry, Nate.
It's fine. It's fine.
Calvin, if you don't mind, just recapping summarizing your thoughts, please.
No, Oscar. Yeah. So the question was, sort of in a nutshell, what constitutes political identity? So my response to that question was that it's not something that is instantaneous. It doesn't just happen overnight. It's something that sort of you can sort of trace it back in time, and there are various factors. So I provided that background in terms of what constitutes you to believe in a certain way, and then when those beliefs sort of spill over to action, your activism, how you exercise your vote at the ballot box, and how you participate. Let's say you sort of now action it in terms of joining a protest march, fighting for a certain cause, and all of that. And there are, of course, variety of factors. And I've also sort of alluded to the fact that from an academic point of view, the whole issue of political identity, or the topic rather, has been well studied, well researched. It lends itself to the field of political science, sociology, even psychology, and of course anthropology. And there's an intersectionality between those, sort of a multidisciplinary approach in looking at why people think the way they do, why they act the way they do, why they side with certain groups, why they side and support certain issues and causes. And that's globally a phenomenon. But if we have to narrow it down to South Africa, there's an historical legacy, brought about by colonialism, apartheid, sort of those that were on the receiving end, and out of that was born the resistance movement and all of that. So that was just my background in terms of sort of tackling the phenomenon of political identity.
Why
Okay, no,
is it
thanks.
so crucial to talk about it now, Oscar, given the fact that we saw the outcomes of the past election? Why is it so on the forefront now?
Well, it's not so much, Lynette, that it's on the forefront now, because actually we've had identity politics playing a role within voting patterns for quite some time now. It's not only in this last election of 2024. I wrote an article after the last general election, which was in 2019, in which I brought this issue to the fore to say people are sticking to their lagers, and I think that's a problem. And if we look at, for example, just in our face, the success of the Patriotic Alliance under Gayton McKenzie, it is quite obvious that Gayton, who by no means is a fool, he's an intelligent guy. He read the situation. He knew that identity politics plays a role and a part, and specifically targeted so-called colored communities in order to get his support base, starting from his disastrous term in Beaufort West and so on and so forth, coming into the Gauteng, Westbury, Eldorado Park, and so forth, and of course playing on the conscience of people in Mitchell's Plain and the Cape Flats. And they have delivered. They voted for Gayton. Gayton is a factor, and that's why Gayton today is a minister in cabinet. Similarly with the Freedom Front Plus, similarly with the religious parties, whether it is Al Jamaa, whether it is the Christian Democrats, etc., etc. So people, unfortunately, according to me, are voting on those identity lines because they find that and then of course the big example I can make, the big example, Annette, is the one that was the big disruptor in this 2024 elections, which was the MK party, and we saw more than 2 million Zulu speaking people voted for MK. Those are people that traditionally would have voted for the ANC. Zuma knew this. Zuma has always been a tribalist, as you know, has always endeared himself to the Zulu royalty and kingdom. And in many ways, after King Zwelithini passed on, many people, many Zulu people in KwaZulu-Natal saw Ubaba as that one that represents our values as Zulu people. And so they voted for him. So it's an unfortunate, according to me, it's an unfortunate phenomenon. It's an unfortunate development because as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't speak to building an integrated, uniformed nation that identifies on some, what can I say, general values. And so I think it is problematic.
But
Yeah.
it wouldn't blossom, Calvin. It wouldn't blossom, Oscar, if there wasn't fertile ground for that. And someone sees the opportunity and latches onto that. So somehow it speaks to the fact that there was a feeling of nationalism amongst colored people in the Western Cape, feeling that they are not heard or seen. And this is an opportunity to be countered. This is someone then in the space of Gayton McKenzie that is willing to stand up and represent us and speak for us. So it had to be there already, and he encapsulated that.
Yes. Okay. So the way I see it, and I want to concur with some of the points that Oscar made. In the absence of, or where there's discontent, then a vacuum arises, and you've got to be very shrewd to exploit, what is at your disposal. Oscar mentioned, Gayton McKenzie, and said that he's clever. So he's really politically shrewd. What Gayton also did was, so what he did, he sort of balanced his, I want to say, electioneering campaign, basically, or how he sort of appeals to his support base. It is not necessarily very cleverly done, saying outright, I'm going to sort of put the issues and the plight of minorities, in a particular so-called colored community. And I suppose we'll get to talk about this label of so-called colored that I keep on referring myself to, because that's very much part of a political identity in itself. But what Gayton did was, he sort of also put on the forefront the issue of illegal immigration. Okay, that's the one thing also. So he made sure that he sort of satisfies another constituency as well. What he also did was, he made people from communities, he put them at the forefront of the party or leadership structures within communities. So ex-gangsters, he would make them sort of part of the structures for people to identify with whoever in their community, because the people are part of that community. But to get back, really, when there's discontent, a vacuum sort of develops, and then you've got to be clever and you've got to be very quick to capitalize onto that. Another thing that I want to say, I've penned a report, or was a contributor for the Mr. report that looked at the elections, as you're aware of, this past elections, and I focus on the Northern Cape. And although I'm not from the Northern Cape, I had to familiarize myself with the dynamics there in terms of the population, voting trends, voting patterns over time, and all of that, and where people find themselves. Oscar mentioned the Freedom Front. We know Orania is there, a case in point of people identifying with that. How will the Freedom Front Plus put that issue that is very dear, self-determination to the Afrikaners, on the agenda, taking that forward? Will the ANC be accommodating, although they didn't get the majority, And then, of course, the PA made inroads there as well. There's the First Nations of the country is sort of in the Northern Cape, predominantly the Khoi and the San people, and I suppose we'll talk about later on, because that's also a spin-off of political identity. So Oscar also mentioned MK, the appeal that Zuma's got, predominantly Zulu. So that's ethnic. That's an ethnic facet towards political identity. So not only just racial, ideological, but also ethnic. That is not necessarily a bad thing. It can have disastrous consequences. We saw what happened with ethnocentricity up in Rwanda, I think the early 2000s, with sort of a genocide there. But I don't think we're there yet. But it's undeniable that we will see politics going that way. It has been, as Oscar said, for a number of years, when we can sort of pinpoint and say, okay, if we racialize it and say, okay, which segment of the population voted for a particular party, you will find clear lines there. And just in conclusion, I've said in the last interview, the national question has not been answered. And the ANC failed dismally. Although Oscar says, it's sort of quite disheartening that we are at this point where we have to talk about, sort of identity politics and so forth. But then again, in the absence of the ANC addressing the issue fully, completely, we are at this point where we are now talking about it. Yeah.
is what we're seeing goes against everything that we said in 1994 we wanted to be, a nation that where everybody feels at home, Oscar, where we represent and subscribe to our constitution, that as many languages and cultures that we have, this is the one thing, is the love for the country that binds us. But it seems that much of that longing for the democracy and what we fought for, that is somehow slipping through our fingers.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the truth is that, of course, what we strive for is to build a unified, non-racial, non-sexist, prosperous South Africa. And that is a fact. That's what we want. Unfortunately, we cannot deny the many centuries of discrimination, segregation, and racism that has defined our nation. And of course, as we know, in the latter years, apartheid. So it is going to take a long time. There was, as you know, Lynette, a particular euphoria post 1994. And so in that election, so-called coloreds from the Western Cape and elsewhere decided to be part of a bigger project, to be part of this transformation that is happening, and therefore voted the ANC into power. Even in the Western Cape, people tend to forget that. But as time developed, they completed their first term. The euphoria was no longer there, and people were now going back into their lager and their mentalities and so forth. And as you know, I come from Cape Town. I now live and reside in Johannesburg, but I go down to Cape Town. I have a braai with people, and they will tell you, these Black Africans are being bussed in from the Eastern Cape. They want to become the majority in the Western Cape, and so on and so forth.
I heard that too.
And those kinds of counterfactual things are believed. There's a lot of people in the Western Cape, for example, coloreds, who believe that jobs are being taken by Black Africans at their expense, just like white are believing it in Gauteng and other parts of the world. But when you look at the actual evidence, the facts, you will find that so-called coloreds still remain in the majority in your management and your middle management structures in the Western Cape across sectors. And it's just simply not true that they are being usurped by Black Africans and so on. But that is the belief. And so we have a long way to go. We have a long way to go to try and reverse some of those thinking.
Yeah. So, do you want to ask something,
Has
Lynette?
this derailed? Yeah, and I'm going to let you. I want you to comment on what Oscar said, because I'm getting, and I know from the conversations I've had on other shows where there are colored people, specifically in the Western Cape and in the Northern Cape, that feel that their complaints and their concerns are legitimate. And you just kind of made the sound, Oscar, that's unfounded. So I want you to comment on that. But I also want us to talk about how the bigger vision that we had in mind, how is this being derailed by identity politics and people wanting to go into their little enclaves?
Yeah, I think Oscar mentioned the euphoria of 94, the dawn, or 1990 even, sort of immediately after the unbanning of liberation movements and all of that. And then obviously culminating in 94 when we had our first democratic elections. And then after that, we were caught up in that, that reconciliatory period that Mandela brought in. And 95, we all sang the national anthem, the new national anthem at the World Cup and all of that. But then that euphoric dust settled. and then rightfully so, we find people now 30 years later sort of retreating back to their enclaves. Now, I am not so informed about the statistics in terms of
Mm.
the demographics and how well represented they are. I mean, Oscar mentioned the Western Cape, Cape Town in particular, that so-called colored people, by being the sheer majority in the province, would necessarily, that will be reflected in the employment statistics. I'm not so sure. So I'm not going to dare speak on that. I'm not disputing what you said, Oscar. However, we all know that parties that propagate redress, or not necessarily redress, what they are propagating is that there should be a real look at policies that were brought in to redress, like BE, affirmative action, employment equity. When will these policies reach its ceiling? For me, it's counterproductive. And now I know the counter argument is that, well, we've got to redress. There's been a historical imbalance in all of that. But how long is it going to take? And as long as it's continuing, it leads to the exclusion of minority groups and of marginalized groups, because some people believe it's just another form of social engineering aimed at excluding people, pretty much what apartheid did, excluding people to the means of acquiring, wealth, and not necessarily wealth, but decent jobs and jobs that are meaningful and all of that. So that is the reality. I mean, I'm on record as saying that, in where I find myself in the space that I work, there is no upward mobility. It's very clearly stated that we are looking for this and that particular preferred candidate. So for someone that did its little part back in the 80s to fight for what Oscar calls, and I mean, we all know this, non-racial, democratic, and non-sexist South Africa, to find myself in a situation 30 years later when I enter the job market to still be excluded based on race, that could just be my perception, but it resonates with many other people out there. And I hear what Oscar's saying, that people believe things that parties are propagating. I'm just thinking about the Cape Colored Congress, Fadil Adams, I think, driving across very strongly the fact that when he goes to Mitchell's Plain, to the mall there, he sees only ethnic black cashiers, for instance, in a neighborhood that is predominantly colored, that sits with a situation where unemployment is rife. So how do you unravel that and make sense of that? And how do you tell that to the person on the street? Listen, you cannot get a job, even if you are from Mitchell's Plain. I'm not even from Cape Town. So it's difficult for people out there to reconcile what is happening with their reality. It's very difficult, and even to sort of unpack it to them and say, listen, yeah, but this is part of redress. But when will we see the end of that? I don't know. I don't have an answer for that, quite frankly.
Mm.
Mm.
But that's what created the vacuum, because they felt
Exactly.
that they weren't being heard and they felt that they weren't
Yeah.
being seen. Oscar?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I agree with Kevin to the extent that we need to actually be more sensitive to localities, because
Yeah.
the truth is that if you are looking at the retail sector within the Mitchells Plain area, it goes without saying that the unemployed young people of that particular area are the ones that must obviously occupy those jobs. I mean, and the truth is that that is the reality. We also know, and Kevin will agree with me, that the private sector, extremely skewed in the hands of white South Africans, are the ones that are perpetuating some of
Yeah.
the divide and rule kind of things. For example, Annette, wrote an article, and I knew that it was not going to be received well, but I dared to write an article in which I basically introduced the hypothesis that said the reason why white business owners in the hospitality sector and the restaurants, hotels, and so on and so forth, the reason why they prefer to employ foreign national Africans is not only because they can be exploited, they are not unionized and all of that, they can't object and so on and so forth. But I introduced another element, and I'd like to hear Kevin's view on this. I said there is a power dynamic that white South Africans want to avoid. Because of our racist past, they don't want to interact with Black Africans, Black South Africans, as an equal relationship. I mean, even though you are the employer, workers have rights. You can't talk down on workers. You need to treat them with respect. You need to treat them in some respects as equals. And white South Africans are not yet mentally prepared to do that with Black South Africans. They don't have that power dynamic with Black foreigners.
Yeah, no.
You're talking about that.
Yeah.
I'm saying that they are necessarily racist towards Black foreigners, but they don't have that power dynamic because a Black South African, if a white boss wants to now treat them like a child, talk down to them, that person is invariably going to say, excuse me, you're not allowed to talk to me like that. We're not in apartheid. You treat me with respect. And I think, in my opinion, white business owners are not yet prepared to cross that divide.
To latch onto that, Calvin, to latch onto that, Jeanette posted a question, a comment. So you can respond to what Oscar said and his views on that. Jeanette writes, your thoughts also on the government of national unity and illegal foreigners. I think it latches on well to the point that Oscar just made.
Yeah. So I'm going to respond to the first part, the points that Oscar raised now, and the question, that he asked about sort of that power dynamic, when it comes to being white and being the employer, owning a business. He mentioned the hospitality industry in particular, where you find a lot of foreigners working. So they're part of the problem when it comes to illegal foreigners, because they would employ foreigners, foreign Africans, to put it that way. And some of them, a lot of them would be undocumented. And remember now, when you're undocumented, you already enter that relationship on your back foot or back feet, if I can put it that way. You enter that employment relationship sort of being at the mercy of the one that's employing you, your desperation. You are there of desperation. Now, if you were a South African and a white employer should, as Oscar said, sort of speak to you in a condescending way and sort of tell you things that or tell you to do things that's outside of the ambit of the employment relationship, you would question that, because precisely you come from that past where you were subjected, to unfair discrimination and unfair labor practices and all of that, and you'd be mindful of that. But if you're an undocumented foreigner in particular, you'd rather just suck that up and just do, and what that does, it spills over into animosity between the South African blacks on the one hand and foreign blacks. So that perpetuates that sort of dynamic there. And even further, where we would say that, okay, I mean, we're talking about colored identity also. Yeah, that these foreigners are taking our jobs, not just blacks' jobs, but our jobs as well. That's where, parties like the PA sort of are capitalizing on that whole idea. So it's interesting. I know there are people that are mentioning this, that foreigners are here to take our jobs. So not only your traditional South African black community taking jobs of marginalized groups such as the coloreds, but even your foreigners as well. So that just adds fuel to the fire and just adds to this whole antithesis of the nation building project that was on the agenda, when we came out of apartheid. It's just another fact of derailing that project.
Kevin, can I just add, Lynette, talking about the new, isn't it interesting that one of the first things that the DA minister at Home Affairs concerns himself with is this issue of permits and visas for foreign nationals in South Africa? It was one of the first things that he said, I'm going to extend the period and so on and so forth, because He knows that white businesses in particular is benefiting from these foreign nationals. And don't get me wrong, Lynette, and I can speak on behalf of Kevin as well, if I may be so bold. This is xenophobia. This is just talking about the practical reality around what do we do with undocumented, illegal foreign Africans that are actually Uber drivers, delivery, Uber Eats, you name it. That's the jobs that they do. I mean,
Domestic
how,
workers.
the white businesses will use this usual mantra that they are better educated, that they have a better command of English. But the truth of the matter is, how difficult is it to bring 2 or 3 plates of food from the kitchen to the table? What kind of command of English do you require? So I think that, and here I want to talk about the GNU, but also government in general. We do need to, the way government has dealt with this issue has been the ostrich approach. They are putting their head in the sand. They want to deny that it is a problem. And as a result, what you have is skirmishes and fightings in Mitchell's Plain between those that are on the one side of the road in squatter camps and so forth, and of course your so-called colored communities saying that they are taking jobs, they are taking this, that, and the other thing. So the time of avoiding this problem is over. The more we can confront it, the better.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree,
So,
Lynette.
for those who've
Yeah.
joined us in a moment, let me just hold on, Calvin, just hold on. Let me just give context to whomever have joined us and weren't here from the start of our discussion this evening. That was Dr. Oscar van Heerden, who was just concluding his thoughts. We're going to concentrate also and just touch on Jeanette's question earlier on when she wanted your opinion on the GNU. Our other guest is Dr. Calvin Knowles. We're talking about identity politics. Some say it's the elephant in the room. We don't want to talk about it because it puts us back into discussions where we had to confront our apartheid past. But the reality is, if you look at the outcomes of our past election now in May 2024, a lot of South Africans voted across racial lines. They preferred to congregate and associate with their kind, and I'm going to put their kind in inverted commas because we've seen this in KwaZulu-Natal with the absolute rise, miraculous, some would say, but definitely some have called it tribalism. But you can't ignore it. You can't ignore the Patriotic Alliance. And what does that say about where we find ourselves as South Africans and our way forward? So this is what we're discussing. You are welcome to ask questions, to comment, to take issue with some of my guests' opinions. They are quite fine. They're both political analysts. They know the history of the country. They can talk to any point that you raise. So please feel free to share the live. But if you want a comment or you want a question to ask it, just type it in the comment section in the chat and we will definitely facilitate it. Thank you for indulging me to give some background. Calvin, go ahead.
Yeah. No. So there's a number of points that I want to speak to. One is, Oscar also alluded to that the ostrich head in the sand sort of approach. Just put your head in the sand and sort of, if you don't see it, then it's not there. I think the government left this for too long to fester. And again, Oscar speaks and he says one's got to be cautious, not to sound xenophobic. None of us are xenophobic, at the end of the day. If you juxtapose xenophobic and we say, okay, the opposite could be that we're nationalists, that's what's happening in other parts of Europe, with the whole asylum-seeking crisis, illegal immigrants and all of that. I just saw today that the Netherlands, sort of the right-wing party, whose name eludes me now, said they're going to withdraw from the EU in terms of their asylum agreement that they have with the EU, and they're going to put strict measures in place. In fact, I've also read a while ago that what's happening in the Netherlands is that the indigenous population or the Dutch people are now sort of in the minority. There's a lot of immigrants there. You cannot run away and escape the impact that it's got. And let us put racism aside, or xenophobia and all these isms and all of that. It's got an economic impact too. Oscar mentioned that it doesn't take a PhD to carry 3 plates of food to a table. The argument also is that these are scarce skills, they're hardworking, and all of those things, What does it say about us as South Africans? Aren't we not hardworking? Does it then inadvertently also entrench the perception that we are lazy as South Africans, Whereas we need the government to provide the opportunities for us. And you see and now I think I border on sort of sounding xenophobic, but it's got nothing to do with that. This is our reality. I was born here. I'm not going to leave the country in search of greener pastures. And I need a government that's going to make and present opportunities for me based on my skill set and that of my children. I don't have to immigrate because I want to contribute to this country. And you don't have to look elsewhere necessarily. Academia is full of foreigners, you see. I've mentioned it to you, and again, now I border and I can be labeled as xenophobic. It's got nothing to do with that. I'm not in mainstream academia. I'm not at university. I cannot get in. I'm not saying it's because foreigners are occupying the spaces in political science, governance, where that my skill set is about. I'm just saying it is still a reality, and people are starting to talk about it. But it's how we navigate the discussions around that. I think that needs to be interrogated, but we must at the same time not pussyfoot around issues that affect us, that stalls us in going forward. So I think it's necessary to discuss, and I'm glad we're having this discussion now. Yeah.
Lynette, I see
Because this
my
is the thing. This is the thing. I do think we're pussyfooting around it. Yes, Oscar?
no, I see you smiling. I'm simply having apple juice. It's apple juice.
This is water. Clear water.
Yeah. I apple juice. Okay. So look, to come to the question that one of the listeners and viewers raised,
Jeanette.
I think the government of national unity is an indication of the maturity of our democracy.
Yes.
As you know, I'm a member of the ANC. I'm a staunch member of the ANC. I loved the idea that we were the one party that were in charge for 30 years. It suited me and many others and so on and so forth. But the reality of the 2024 election is that we have now joined the ranks of mature democracies elsewhere in the world, in particular Europe, but also in Latin America and the Far East. Those countries in those parts of the world are very familiar with coalition politics. It is rare that you have one party who is dominating the elections and wins the elections. You look at Mexico, you look at Brazil. Lula has formed alliances and coalitions with just about everyone, including far parties and so on, in order to remain in power. And so in South Africa, we've had a fantastic ride, some would argue, including me, but the truth is that this last election has simply meant that the people of South Africa, the voters of South Africa, are saying that they want a bit more diversity, they want a different say, they want a different agenda, and so on and so forth. And what's good about the government of national unity is that for the first time in our democracy, opposition parties are now also accountable for delivery. This is a good thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
If we get agriculture wrong, if we cannot sort out our citrus dilemma at the WTO and with Botswana, then we are going to blame who? Steenism. If we are going to more and more problems with illegal immigrants and people coming across our borders, undocumented, etc., we are going to hold accountable the Minister of Home Affairs, regardless of the fact that that is a DA minister. And I think this is a good thing for our democracy. It's a good thing. I suspect, if I can be so bold, I suspect that come 2029, not 2026, but 2029, the ANC might claw back some of its support base. That 3 to 4 million South Africans that registered but did not go to the poll. I think they are equally shocked with the 40%. And they might say, look, I'll braai at 3 in the afternoon, but I'm going to go and vote. The issue then, and I'd like to hear Kevin's position on this, the issue then is not automatic that they're going to vote ANC. The issue then is they're going to say, do I vote ANC or do I vote MK? And that is the issue. ANC
I want to talk about that. I want to talk about that because earlier on we discussed and spoke about the realities of South Africans, particularly coloured South Africans in the Western Cape, in Mitchell's Plain and other areas, and why they gravitated towards the Patriotic Alliance and the Cape National Congress, why that happened. So let's talk about MK, for example, because when we saw the results, I think it was Helen Zille and others who had said, well, we definitely see tribalism. That came into play, and it actually kind of latches on to what Alroy Swats writes, and he says, identity politics have always been part of South African politics. Everyone just preferred to pretend that it wasn't a factor. Only now are people finally being honest about it. So have we been in denial also about what was happening in KwaZulu-Natal?
Yeah, so a number of issues. One, for me, political identity is fluid. There's a fluidity around political identity. It's not something that's static. When we had our last chat, Lynette, I remember I said to you that, and I mean, Oscar mentioned it. I don't know if he said he's still a member of the ANC or was. I was a member of the ANC. I'm currently, not affiliated to any political party. Because I said to you, that was the party that liberated me. So I, was very much part of that, not sentimental vote, but I voted for the liberator. But then over time, and I call that my second liberation. When the economic or socioeconomic realities and the political context changed for me, and hence my political identity shifted to where it shifted. Is neither here nor there. It's just that I became disillusioned, and that is the word or something that drives people away from where they found themselves over a number of years. And then they would find themselves, in another political, getting a home in another political party. You mentioned MK. One must not forget that, or maybe one must interrogate the MK or the ANC spin-offs or chops of the block, if that's the correct English term, or splinter of the block. Your EFF comes from the ANC. I've mentioned it before. Chips of the block, the MK now. So we interrogate the reasons why. Is it really because they have become fed up with the way the ANC is going about in terms of economic policy, sort of in Afrikaans, they call it hulle vry nou na die DA, sort of going to sort of a new liberal sort of path and all of that? Or is it just the politics of, how can I put it now, just trying to be difficult? And you've mentioned MK, ethnic. You must not forget that the MK party got the most votes in KwaZulu-Natal. Oscar, you must just correct me if I've got it wrong here, But they kept out of power precisely because of a provincial government of national unity now in KwaZulu-Natal. So that is to stem that ethnic tide, sort of what's happening in KZN. But it did remarkably well, which means that there's discontent within the ANC. I know, and I've read, not I know for sure, but there are factions. The ANC is a deeply factionalized organization and has been for a number of years, for a long time now. And during the negotiations for this GNU, sort of when the results came out, when the ANC was the majority party, not to govern, but still 40% of the vote, when it reached out to a political party, another one. There were camps in the ANC that said, no, 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 we don't want you to go the DA route, sort of go to the progressive caucus. Let's get this MKEFF caucus going. So come 2026, as Oscar said, they will claw back. I was careful and cautious to predict when Jan Joubert's book came out, who will govern, will we have a national coalition in 2024? I was very skeptical. I said, no, the ANC will retain its majority, but now look what happened. If they claw back, it will be, and this might sound a little bit controversial, it might be because they will be running on the back of ministers, non-ANC ministers, that are performing, that makes government work. And that will give them sort of that lost votes back. I think people see the bigger picture and sort of say, okay, no, this could be an ANC success. Although, I mean, the DA puts it out there. I've got a problem with that. The DA Minister of Home Affairs. It should be the South African Minister of Home Affairs, but clearly capitalizing on that because people are saying on social media that the DA Minister of Home Affairs is making things work, So, yeah.
Yes. I think it's quite important that we talk about that because as much as we are lauding this GNU, I have seen also comments on social media, in particular on TikTok, for example, when Gayton ensured they say Gayton made sure that they were able to see the All Blacks and the Springboks playing on SABC. And all of that. They are saying, look at these ministers. We should have done this a long time ago. Suddenly there's movement. Suddenly there's no long queues for this. Like they are the kingmakers. They are Merlin making things happen. Yeah. When will we actually see us moving away from being politically party specific?
Yeah, Lynette, the truth is, and this is where
Oscar, I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I want to just slightly disagree with Kevin for the first time this evening.
You're welcome.
Which is that I think in keeping with the theme of the discussion tonight, there are lots of Black South Africans, and when I say Black, I mean Black in general, colored, Indian, Black African, that are precisely going to vote for the ANC because they don't want to be governed by whites. And I'm not saying that because I agree with it. I'm saying that it's going to motivate them. There are huge sentiments on social media within the ANC and outside of the ANC that says, oh my God, we are giving the country back to whites. They are now coming back and they are governing and so on and so forth. And I'm saying not because I'm ANC, but I'm saying because I understand this phenomenon of identity politics and the elephant in the room being the race issue. I think a lot of Black South Africans who did not go to the poll is going to run to the poll and say, oh, no. We can't have Helen Zille telling us what it's going to be and how it's going to be, so on and so forth. And so we're going to either vote ANC traditionally, or we're going to vote MK. And on that score, I want to say, there was some belief that, if Zuma dies or, then MK will fall apart. I don't think that is true anymore. They've been very clever about how they've reconstituted the party, got rid of sort of dead wood, if you like, voting fodder, and have brought in more serious elements into parliament and so on and so forth. Brian Molefe and many others, Judd Klope and so forth. These are Lucky Montana. These are very clever people. You might not like them, but they are very clever. And they already, as far as I'm concerned, can see and can taste cabinet positions. They know that come 2029, if they are going to play a particular game and particular rules and they do it well, they might very well be in government in 2029 if the ANC doesn't wake up.
Okay, so can I respond?
But wait, no, I have a question first. I have to ask this. I want to be sure that I understand that what you're saying that you think people, just because they want to keep out a white government or be ruled by white people, that will make them and motivate them enough to go and vote. Whereas what I'm hearing and seeing is people are relieved because in their opinions, black, white, Indian, whatever you call them, they feel finally we are getting service delivery. They've been disillusioned and separated from what the ANC promised and those beautiful ideals that they subscribed to at once upon a time. They've become so disillusioned. They are just too grateful that they have this and they have that, and that they're not looking at color. They're not looking at race. So we've got to talk about that if you are convinced that that would be a big enough motivator for them to go and vote, only because they don't want to be under white rule, in inverted commas again. Wait, go ahead, Calvin, before
Yeah.
Oscar responds.
Yeah, so for me, that takes me back to the whole fear mongering that Zuma did, when he said, if you vote for the DA, apartheid will return. Okay, and now I'm going to become a bit uncouth. And I'm going to say that the electorate of the ANC, majority of the electorate, when we look at educational levels, to who is he saying that? Who's going to believe that? We know that when the DA, and I'm not an apologist for the DA, I don't belong to the DA, I'm not a supporter of the DA, but in the bigger scheme of things, you cannot in your right mind believe that when the DA, let's say we have a DA government, which I don't think will happen anyway, that apartheid will return, it will never. So Zuma, when he made that very, very controversial statement, it found fertile ground, unfortunately. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately because what you are doing is you are now painting this picture that we're going to go back to the dark old days. And now it's still being sustained. I mean, Zuma, when he had this press conference of the MK party now, I think 3 weeks ago, less than a month ago, it was very explicit. We are doing this for the black child, putting that on the agenda, Yes, it's needed, it's got its constituency and all of that. But at the end of the day, if for me, it borders also on that sentimental vote. I will keep on voting for the ANC because they liberated me. It's like being caught up in an abusive relationship. And I don't want to make light of that. You are being beaten all the time. You go make a case at the police station, but then you withdraw the case. You are not one to complain. You cannot complain. It doesn't give you the right to complain because you had alternatives, but you were clouded by semantics. You were clouded by people trying to play tricks on your mind and saying that you're going to go back to apartheid, which will never happen. Common sense should actually tell you that it will never happen. So that is my take on that. That is just it's frivolous, it's ridiculous, it's stupid, quite outright. The second thing is what Oscar mentioned about the MK party positioning itself, with bringing in bright minds, black minds, if I can call it that. Well, depending again on the narrative that's out there, the Lucky Montanas, the Brian Molefes of this world, and all of those people that's got key roles and are in parliament now for the MK party, they've got a cloud over their heads. They've been implicated in state capture, corruption. I don't know how you can reconcile, if you're a supporter then, or ascribe to that, with people that there's evidence that, or at least prima facie evidence, that they have been complicit in state capture, corrupt dealings, and all those kind of negative things. So it becomes then, okay, the DA mentioned the MK-EFF is like a doomsday coalition. For me, it's like the cabal of the corrupt, and I'm going to say it on this platform. And all the lofty ideals of advancing the black child, I'm going to mention that was Zuma's words, for me is overshadowed by the people that you have within your party that's representing your constituency in parliament. It just doesn't, they've got no referent power. They might be brilliant economists or have brilliant managerial skills, but even that is clouded by what they did when they were in charge of the things that they were in charge of.
And all I'm saying, Kevin, is that is why they cannot lose. That is why they have so much to lose. That is why they
Yes,
want to be in government,
I know.
to avoid
L-
jail time and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
Come
yeah,
back to your Lynette, to come back to your point, the truth of the matter is that um, people are anti DA, people are anti white,
mm,
and I'm not. I agree with it, but I'm just expressing that that's the sentiments out there.
yeah,
And the truth of the matter is the DA cannot claim to want to provide a better alternative, as they do,
mm,
obviously. But
mm,
the truth of the matter is, because what has happened in the 2024 election, punishing the ANC, already happened in the previous local government election.
yeah,
And so
mm,
DA has been in government, has been in governance of Kabeja,
mm,
of Johannesburg, of Ikuruleni, and of Tshwane. These are big billions of rands of budgets, and they have completely messed it up. This is a fact. It seems
mm,
that the people they have, the the good people they have in the city of Cape Town, if you want to believe the narrative of the DA, cannot be replicated elsewhere. They can only manage Cape Town in a good way, apparently. And even that, I must be honest, if you talk to a person like me, I will tell you, my entire family is from Cape Town. They live on the Cape Flats and they stretch from Hanover Park, Manenberg to Mitchell's Plain to Delft. And
same here.
I'm not fooled by the well-run city and the city that works for you, as the DA claims. Not at all. But more importantly, for a number of years, they've messed
Mm.
up Johannesburg. Herman Mashaba was in charge, and then Kevin, help me here. Who was the lady that came after Palazzi?
inform, yeah,
Yeah,
inform Palazzi.
Uh, they completely messed up the city. So when Mayor Morera, who Dada is now being told you need 200 billion for infrastructure and this and that and the other thing, and the water is a problem, where must we lay the blame? And
Mm.
it's not good enough for the DA to say we've inherited this. 30 years they argue,
Mm.
is quite a long period. Now you take 7 years of that 30. Is that not a long period to run a metro, to fix the problems in a metro? They have run
Mm.
Tshwane completely into the ground. This is a fact. This is not fiction. The AG, they
Mm.
are in debt. The only city in democratic South Africa where you had a cholera outbreak is Tshwane under the DA. So anyway, let me stop. But all I wanted to say is that the DA cannot claim to be providing a better alternative because they simply are not producing the goods.
Just get back to our discussion this evening about identity politics, and I think it was Alroy that said earlier on, we finally facing up to it. And to those who align themselves with a MK Umkhonto we Sizwe party or a political alliance, to them that's unifying them, their ideals. And to us looking on the outside who aren't part of those parties, we see it as being divisive going forward, particularly if you look at what our bigger goal has been. Jeanette sent a comment earlier on, and she wanted your thoughts on the Rainbow Nation. We're far removed from that because people are kind of organizing themselves in groups, whether it's based on religion, whether it's politics, race, whatever their affiliation is. That is the reality. But how does that then affect this bigger picture of what we're trying to achieve going forward? Let's please talk about that. And then let's also talk about the First Nations, that their interests in no way features in any of these agendas, manifestos, what we've seen some of these ministers say. It's as if they never were, Calvin.
Yeah, that's a sad case. The rights of indigenous people globally. We saw what happened in North America. But closer to home, the Khoi and San people. We know in the past, in apartheid, there was deliberate. It was deliberate to sort of rewrite the history of these people and their contribution, and acknowledging them outright as the first people of South Africa. And they would have hoped that post 94 in a democratic South Africa, there there would be a bigger emphasis on their historical place as the indigenous people of the country. But I think the ANC, and I'm mentioning the ANC because they were the government there for the longest of times, tried to address this. But it wasn't adequately addressed. I don't know, quite frankly, to be honest. I must admit that I don't have the answer in terms of how they are going to really, really sort of tackle this issue. I don't know if they're still camping out in front of the union buildings. I've spoken to the gentleman about 8 years ago when I visited Pretoria, and he highlighted their plight, and I think they're still there. I don't know, but there's almost like a tardiness in talking about the preservation of the culture of these people and acknowledging them and giving them their rightful place in history. But at the expense of the majority of blacks in terms of their culture preservation. I don't know. And there again, I'm treading on that thin line of us and them and they and all of that division and almost being divisive, which I'm not trying to be. But it is a sad indictment, I think, that these people role is not recognized fully. I don't know what Oscar's views are about this.
Yeah, so Lynette, my view is very simple, and I've written about this.
I know.
The Khoi people and the San people were an inconvenience for the colonialists and for the apartheid government. And the way the apartheid government dealt with it was to introduce a law of classification in 1904. And so to deny the First Nations their right within borders of the Republic, they were all classified as coloureds.
Yeah.
And from that moment on, there was no talk of Khoi people and San people and their indigenous language and cultures and so forth. And for the longest time, from that moment, 1904, the Khoi and the San people obviously was engaged in a struggle against the apartheid government to reclaim their right. And some of them, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on where you sit in history, they joined the ANC in 1912 because the ANC, as you know, Lynette, was formed after the forming of the 1910 Union of South Africa. And the majority blacks and Africans in particular were excluded from that union. And so the Khoi and the San people thought, no, let's identify and partner with our brothers and sisters who has also now been disenfranchised. Unfortunately for them, in the 1950s, I don't have the exact year, Kevin, but I think it was 1954, 1956, somewhere there. The ANC then adopts a policy that talks of blacks in general and Africans in particular. Okay. And the Khoi and the San people at that moment, for the second time, was disenfranchised because they're now not even seen as African anymore.
Yeah.
Remember, the apartheid government classified them as coloreds,
Yeah.
okay, then the ANC,
Mm.
because of their own narrow African nationalist policies,
Yeah.
decided to give them a second blow and say that the struggle as they define it is about blacks in general and Africans in particular. And Africans is
Yeah.
predominantly
Black African.
the
Yeah.
Bantu that
But
came
Mm.
across the northern Limpopo and so on and so forth. So the Khoi people and the San people have been doubly disenfranchised in South Africa. And I think it's a travesty. And I agree with Kevin. The ANC did, in later years in our democracy, try to address it by recognizing them and so on and so forth. But, you know, even when you are involved in COCTA, the Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Ministry government, when you look at the classification
Mm.
amongst the traditional leaders, they talk of the traditional leaders' house and the Khoi and the San. They still make a distinction
the
that the
distinction.
Khoi
Mm.
San is not part of the
Mm.
overall traditional leadership within the
Yeah.
country. Unfortunately, it's a struggle that we are still having to fight. It's a struggle that is going to take a long time. But
Mm.
the good thing is that within a democratic frame, with a democratic constitution and Bill of Rights, the Khoi and the San people and the legitimate leaders of those people does have room to maneuver, to argue, and to use the courts in
Yeah.
their favor. But it's going to be a battle and a struggle for a number of years still.
Yeah.
Mm. Let me quickly read Elroy's comment. My heart bleeds for the Khoisan people who are never even in the room when race, economics, and land issues are discussed. They have no seat at the table. And that is what we have said this evening. So in terms of talking about identity politics, it's not going to go away. But that worries me is who speaks for them then, Oscar?
Look, I mean, the truth is, and I have to be honest, just like we've been honest the whole evening. There's lots of division and
Yep.
tension within the Khoi and the San
Pride.
community.
And,
You
yeah.
know, they with each other, who's royalty, who's not royalty. I think the
Yes,
positive I
yes.
want to make is that they are not the only ones. Look, the Xhosas are still fighting
Yes, true.
who's the
Uh-huh.
right king and so on, and also the Pedis and so forth. So it's not something new
Mm,
amongst the Khoi and the San people, but I do think they need to
mm,
resolve their differences. They need to agree on who are the legitimate representatives of the tribe, because if they don't, then they will continue in history as not being recognized and so on and so forth. So I think it will take time, but I do think they will get there, and eventually we will know who are the real people. I mean, you know, some of the problems, or part of the problem, Lynette, is that when you honor a person like Stierman, which the is you know the Kabeja
mm.
airport is
David,
now,
David Spearman.
David
yeah,
Spearman, yeah.
Stierman. You know, there's a cross pollination between the Griquas and the Khoi and so on, and so forth and so forth. So
Mm,
it's a very dynamic and interesting history. And I do want to say, and this is a point I almost forgot. I do want to say to the viewers and the listeners, you know, if you are interested in this, two, if you like, unofficial historians. When what I mean by that is that you know they are not necessarily formally, they've not traveled or traversed the formal path of history, but Patrick Mallet, who
I was
wrote
gonna ask you. Yes,
Yeah.
19,
I
1652. Yes.
he has brought out a new book now in the last few weeks about Cape slavery. You know, much has been written about the transatlantic slave trade, but not very much about the Indian Ocean slave trade.
Yeah.
You know, slaves that came
Mm,
from Malaysia, Indonesia, and so forth, China, and so on. I would really recommend that. And the second one is Reuben Richards, Dr. Ruben Richards, studied at UCT, currently, interestingly, mayor of Clyde-William, not necessarily, not under ANC banner, I might add. But he's written two very interesting books. The one is Human Bastards or Human, volume 1 and 2, and bastards in the classical sense of mixed race and so on and so forth, mulattoes and the like. And the second one, which I found very interesting, was a book called Hottentot's Hospitality, which is a fascinating book, Lynette. It talks about why were Europeans so interested in the Cape. The official history is that we were trading post on the way to India and so on. And that is true, but there were other more important factors that the Europeans were also taking into consideration. For example, when you are a seafaring nation, like the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, there are three things that are very important when you spend months and months on the open seas. The one is fresh water. You need fresh water to survive. 2, you need protein, you need meat and vegetables. And 3, you need to be able to preserve that meat and those fresh vegetables, because as you know, in those centuries, there were no ice cubes. So you needed salt. You needed salt to actually compact the meat and the fruit and veg to be able to sustain for long periods. And apparently, according to Dr. Richards, in the Cape, those three things were in abundance. The fresh water from the Table Mountain and the tributaries, lots and lots of salt pans in what we now today know as Salt River, and plenty of cows and herds and so on. Jan van Riebeeck, for example, wrote in his diaries, you could, for as far as the eye could see, you had cattle from the Khoi people. And of course, with linking up with Patrick Mallett's book, With the Lie of 1652, as we now know, Cape Town was a bustling port city way before, so our people, our Khoi and San people, already knew then that they needed to trade in salt, in fresh water, and in meat, and so on and so forth. So very interesting histories that talks to where our identities come from.
Yeah, I made a note. He's on my whiteboard, Patrick, to invite him, because I do think that we're going to have to create like 2 or 3 hours when you talk and what we've been taught in school, and allow him to challenge that, because I think there are quite a lot of South Africans that still hold on to that history, the way it was presented to us, and it written and what we had to learn and regurgitate. And it would be good if we talk about the history of South Africa to have that discussion again. Let's try and wrap as far as we can, and talk about where does this leave us then, Calvin? How do we have this discussion going forward, talking about South Africa and what we want for the country? Do we see, I know earlier on Oscar said that he thinks that there's going to be a huge shift in 2029, and that we might see a lot of voters that were maybe hesitant in the past actually going to the polls, and we welcome everybody to go vote. What do you see the impact of this divisions that we've seen going forward, Calvin? And then I want Oscar's take on that as well, because the reality is we've got a GNU. So much already has changed in certain provinces, in certain municipalities. Where does that leave us going forward, though?
Yeah, I'm going to try and answer it like this. You see, as political analysts or people in general that's got an active interest in politics and political dynamics and how that impacts governance and all of that, we go back and we look at voting patterns over time. We look at trends. We look at localized voting. That's confined to a certain area. That's why we talk about ethnicity, KZN, Zulus, IFP, and all of those things. And then we look at so-called colored areas, and who normally comes out on top there. But why would the DA continuously, in the face of people being unhappy with the DA, as Oscar alluded to earlier on, come up and triumph in the Western Cape and all this and that? So we look at all those sort of nuances and all of that, and try and sort of make predictions or projections. That's very rife in the time between an electoral cycle, and it gets more intense, leading up to an election. And then sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you can get it horribly wrong too. I don't know about Oscar, but I did not necessarily foresee MK doing as well as it did. I remember I spoke to a couple of business people before the elections, and they wanted me to sort of unpack possible scenarios. And MK was not featured in the parties that could potentially cause an upset, and it did cause an upset. It's the third. Isn't it the opposition party now in the GNU? I think so. Because I mean the DA is now not necessarily the official opposition; they're part of the GNU. So where does it lead us going forward? I don't know. I think they did a master stroke with bringing Floyd in from the EFF. Okay, and I've just read today that in terms of their
Unsettled things, yeah.
strategy, they are now going. It's rumored that they're going to employ Zuma's son to do Zane. I think I know it's a two and the one is to do Zile. I don't know which is the anyway.
To design.
Employ him, yeah, or deploy him to the universities to get that very strong student component that the EFF is so strong in, to get them over to MK. And once you get that, because remember, that is where the EFF thrived, in institutions of higher learning. They won a lot of SRCs. They were running these SRCs and all that. So very strategically, galvanizing support leading up to an election going forward. And I think it is not. I mean, obviously, for me as a citizen, would I say it's worrying? Yes, yes. But then again, for those who ascribe to what they are propagating, for them, it's the next best thing to slice bread that can happen, leading up to the elections. So I think they will galvanize more support. A lot of it is locked up in the persona of Jacob Zuma and the charisma that he brings. And that sort of means a lot to people, not necessarily confined to the Zulu nation itself. It resonates with a big part. And in terms of the EFF, I think they're going to make the the EFF obsolete in time, and that 9% might shrink, I think, even further. If I'm reading the cards correctly, I don't know how Oscar feels about it.
No, I think, as you know, Lynette,
Oscar?
I have to run, but let me just make some concluding remarks. One, I agree with Kevin that the EFF days are numbered. Julius is putting up a brave face, but the decline is inevitable, especially now that there is an alternative in the form of MK. One. Two, I think that identity politics, in keeping with your theme, Lynette, identity politics is dividing for South Africa. It doesn't speak to building a nation. It doesn't speak to us having a unified identity. Apartheid and racism is so strong and so persistent that unfortunately we are still subscribing to those racial lines as coloreds, Indians, Muslims, Christians, and so forth, Afrikaners and the likes. And I just want to say this. I think that the sooner the electorate can move away from political parties, the better. And what I mean by that is that, I think people are too obsessed with identifying with this or that political party. I think what people need to do is look at what is our values, what is my values, what do I stand for? And of course, if I'm a racist, I'm going to vote for a racist party. But if I'm not a racist, if I want a better life, jobs, if I want freedom of this, that, and the other thing, then I'm going to vote according to that. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, as people are voting at the moment, it is not based on their personal beliefs. I would like to believe they are still finding protection and solace within their little bubbles, and I think that's a bad thing. I think people need to break out of that, and it doesn't mean that the ANC must rule forever. Of course not. I don't think that there is a credible alternative to the ANC yet. I don't think the MK is that. The MK, as far as I'm concerned, is a fascist party. They're anti-constitution. They are
Yeah.
wanting to invade traditional affairs and tribes and tribalism and so on and so forth. So I don't think that they are the credible alternative. I think now that there is murmurings with the Communist Party and COSATU not agreeing with the ANC and their option of a GNU, maybe there lies something that is an alternative. But I think I'm happy, for two things, Lynette. We have a multi-party democracy. That's
Yeah.
very important. And two, we have complete freedom of choice and so on. People are not intimidated with what they choose to do. And I just want to conclude by saying, Lynette, that even though the ANC lost this last election and got only 40%, I think that what people don't realize in South Africa is how the rest of the world is already admiring South Africa and the ANC, for that matter, for having accepted the outcome and having said, the people have spoken. Clearly, we are in the wrong. Let's form a government of national unity and let's see how we can gain back the trust from the people in order to go forward. And I think that's a good thing for our democracy. You look at other democracies,
I'm so glad you say that.
you look at
Exactly.
other, including the United States, and how polarized it is. They tried to assassinate one of their presidential candidates. Thankfully, they failed because no one wants to agree with the death of another person. But this is how polarized things are in the international situation. And South Africa is actually leading by example, and we must continue doing so.
Yes, I think it's important that we do acknowledge that, Oscar, because we have seen how the outcomes of certain elections in our neighboring countries, what that has led to. And thank God we didn't have or experience that. Let's wrap things up. Elroy, let me quickly just recognize his comment. South Africans tend to be more nationalistic than Pan-Africanists. Pan-Africanism, which is just code for black supremacy, has been rejected by most South Africans. That's a good thing, in my opinion. That's Elroy's opinion. Thank you so much for sharing your opinions this evening, Dr. Oscar van Heerden and Dr. Calvin Knowles. Thank you for indulging us. And I'm glad that we called the elephant in the room. We named it, because that concerns me. Is that we
Yeah.
are all trying to be so patriotic and in the effort which we should be on nation building, that it's in Afrikaans there's an expression, die klein jakkalsies wat die wingerd bederf. Those small little things that might seem insignificant in the bigger picture, but those are the things that can break down and destroy the fabric of our society and the dream that we all really want for South Africa. So thank you that you are always speak your mind, Oscar and Calvin. I really appreciate your time this Sunday evening. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you liked and enjoyed this type of conversation, please like and subscribe to the channel so that we can encourage Oscar and Calvin to come on more often and share their views. But we're going to leave it at that. I'm going to say goodbye to them and kick them literally from my studio. Thank you so much, Oscar, and thank you, Calvin, for joining me this evening. And I'm going to say goodbye to them as well. Thank you, Alroy and Jeanette and everybody else for your comments and for sharing the live. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you for the comments. Thank you for the questions, and that we were able to cover so much in a very short space of time. I'm very grateful that we had this conversation. Many more to come, definitely. I made a mental note here and I wrote it down. I'm certainly going to invite Patrick. I think it is important that we talk about what we were taught about history and the history of South Africa, and Jan van Riebeeck coming to the shores in 1652 and what he writes about in his book. So we definitely want to invite him. If you have any suggestions who you think we should have on this platform, feel free to email me, share your suggestions, even in the comment section. My email address is quite simply, here it is. Let me show it to you quickly. Please reach out and share your opinion, and please subscribe to the channel. The more you subscribe and you like and you comment, you engage with the content, not only when I'm live streaming, but some of the other videos that you watch, that kind of sends a message to the algorithm. Things are happening there, and things are happening here. We speak our minds. I love a diversity of opinion, and this is certainly the platform where I will facilitate that and make it possible. So thank you so much for being with us this evening. Much appreciated, and I hope you have a fabulous week going forward. Don't forget to subscribe. Bye, everyone.